Good morning. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. And as was mentioned in my bio, I have a bit of a varied background in terms of my upbringing. I don't know if you can tell this about me, but I was born at a very young age. Okay, no more jokes. Presentation. Got it. Okay. Yeah, so I was born, as was mentioned, overseas in Pakistan, and then spent a portion of my childhood in the Middle East. And in order to give you a little bit of a fuller picture of who I am, when my family came back from overseas, I was relatively young, and just before my 12th birthday, I was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that left me paralyzed from the waist down. And just to give a preface on the topic that I'm going to speak on today, in terms of the problem of pain and suffering, I think it's important that we come at this subject not necessarily from an intellectual perspective, although that is important, but based on the fact that we are all human beings and we all have instances of pain and suffering. And just to fill out what I just mentioned, I want to take you back to a specific date. January 8th of that particular year. When I was home from school, I had the flu, and I was camping out on the bathroom floor for reasons I won't go into, and I woke up from a nap and couldn't feel my legs. And I tried a number of different things, thinking that they were asleep, and I eventually called my parents, who called an ambulance. I was rushed from one hospital to the other, and eventually I was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition called acute transverse myelitis. You see, what the doctors told me happened was that my body's immune system, instead of attacking the flu, attacked the nerve endings at the base of my spinal cord, causing inflammation and leaving me as a paraplegic. The doctor said, the chances of you walking, never mind running, are very slim. You'll have years of physiotherapy. You might as well accept this as your lot. Now, spoiler alert. One month exactly from the day that I woke up and couldn't feel my legs, I woke up on a Saturday morning, got out of bed, walked over to my wheelchair and sat down. And that was it. As quickly as it happened, it went away. And it was the doctors themselves who said, we have no realistic medical explanation. What happened shouldn't have happened. Now, in terms of the topic that I'm going to address today, the reason why this is one of those important topics, I think for me personally, is because during those 30 days, I, as an 11-year-old, started asking questions that no 11-year-old should ask themselves. Questions like, why do bad things happen to seemingly good people? Why pain? Why suffering? Why me? And those are all important questions. They were valid questions. But likewise, as I said before, it's important that we understand this question from a place of understanding. This hit me once again only a couple of years ago when I was on public transit, and I had gotten into a conversation with the person who was waiting at the bus stop with me. And this was the year that the Humboldt Broncos tragedy happened. Do you remember that year? The bus crash. And I was talking back and forth with this person, and he was expressing his heart because he knew someone who was involved in the bus crash. And he said something very stark, something very honest with me that I actually wrote down later because I wanted to remember it. This is what he said. As we went back and forth and we talked about tragedy, he said to me, I can't believe in a God who would allow this to happen. There's an inherent internal contradiction in what Christians believe about God. If God is absolutely powerful, he would be able to deal with evil and tragedy. If he was absolutely good, he would want to deal with evil and tragedy. But seeming random evil and tragedy like the one that I saw, the one that I heard about, that happened only a few weeks before in this interaction, it exists. And therefore, he said, the God that Christians and other theists believe in couldn't possibly exist. I can't even begin to believe in a God because of such contradiction. Only a God who no longer cared for me could kill the people I love. That's very raw. He was going through something. But there's more going on here, because the real problem, the problem of pain and suffering, isn't an intellectual endeavor. And like I said, I want to make it clear that there was a real person in front of me. So I had a philosophical explanation. But that wasn't necessarily what he wanted in that moment. What the person I was talking to didn't realize, however, was that he wasn't actually pining on the law of non-contradiction, as he had expressed to me personally, as much as he was just personally broken. He said it himself. He said, only a God who no longer cared for me would kill the people I love. Now, before I address the personal reality of what he expressed to me, I think it is important to understand that there is a theological, there is a philosophical answer to this question. Because the reality is that this is a question that has been asked for centuries, for millennia. And in the not too distant past, it's been asked by key individuals, key thinkers like Bertrand Russell, who said, how can you talk about God when you're kneeling at the bed of a dying child? Now that's a rhetorically powerful statement. And first, I want to make sure you realize that I'm not actually going to approach the question philosophically or theologically, although I have formal training in both, but I want to approach the question simply as a human being. And so what I want to address first is the fact that evil is something. Evil is something. And you might be wondering, why am I pointing out such an obvious statement? Well, I'm doing so because there is an idea in our world that evil, at least in the way we express it, is not objective but subjective. It doesn't exist outside of us. It exists based on the individual subject in front of you. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche put it this way. He said, you have your way, I have my way. As for the correct way, the right way, the only way, it does not exist. Subjective morality is determined, therefore, by the subject, by the individual who's feeling the pain, based on the subject's likes and dislikes. Subjective truth, a lot of people in our world will say, is based on personal and private preference claims. It's kind of like this. Some people like strawberry ice cream. Some people don't like strawberry ice cream. Some people like murder. Some people don't like murder. Now that seems a very almost comedic way to put it. But if you read the literature, this is almost actually how it's expressed in a lot of the intellectual thinking. For example, here is the philosopher of science from a university in Florida, Michael Ruse, and he says, morality is just a matter of emotions, like liking ice cream and sex and hating toothaches and marking students' papers. I can relate to that one. But it is, and has to be, a funny kind of emotion. It has to pretend that it is not that at all. If we thought that morality was no more than liking or not liking spinach, then pretty quickly it would break down. So, morality has to come across as something that is more than emotion. It has to appear to be objective, even though it is subjective. We just have to kind of pretend about it. But if moral relativism is true, this idea that morality, good and evil, they are relative, they are subjective, then we run into a bit of a problem for the problem of pain and suffering. You see, the problem of evil requires an objective standard of right and wrong in order to raise the objection to begin with. Let me put it in a different way. After I experienced what I believe was a miraculous healing, I felt very passionately that athletics was something that I should invest in. If for no other reason than God had given me a unique experience, exposed me to something that I had taken advantage of, simply being able to wake up and walk out of the room. And so over the years in public school and high school and going into university, I put a lot of time and effort into track and field. I went to York University on an entry scholarship for sprinting. Now, that picture on the screen is not me. It's just a picture of me. Okay, second time, no. Okay. But This begs the question, for me at least personally, is how do we see the difference between a good runner and a bad runner? How do we gauge that type of thing? Goodness and badness are made sense of by the existence of some sort of scoring system. And in the case of a track athlete, 9 seconds is a very fast 100 meter, 20 seconds is a very slow 100 meter. There's a gauge. There's a way to weigh, that's a funny statement, there's a way to weigh the difference between what is good and what is not. Usain Bolt is faster than my neighbor who likes to go jogging a couple times a week. That's just a reality. And we can compare those two by a standard. And this applies every time we use the word. Writer and thinker C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, "My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how did I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line looks like. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust?" It's a good question. How do we know what a healthy tree looks like if without the rot? We only know that something is rotting because we understand what healthy looks like. There are all sorts of comparisons in this. It's like saying, I can't believe in God. Okay, why not? Brussels sprouts. I mean, I can't believe in a God who would make something so distasteful to me. I can't believe in that type of God. And that's a ridiculous complaint. Why is that a ridiculous complaint? Well, because not believing in God because Brussels sprouts exist is not a good enough reason to not believe in God. The problem of evil proves that morals, at least on one level, are absolute in some way. And the same goes for any worldview that claims to not believe in a God, like atheism. Why? Because remember that what I said before, that goodness and badness are made sense by the existence of some sort of scoring system. So we need to ask, where does that scoring system even come from? Let me put it this way, and this is not something I came up with. This is an idea that has been thought out over arguably centuries from different individuals. But the idea is that in order to say something is evil, you have to posit that there is something that is good in order to compare it to. And when you posit that something is good, you have to come up with a moral law. Well, if you're coming up with a moral law, then you have to come up with a moral lawgiver. Why? Because there has to be someone who's handing down those laws. But a lot of atheists and agnostics are trying to prove that a moral lawgiver doesn't exist. So there are different ways that this has been grounded throughout history. One of them being the individual. As I said, this is what's referred to as subjective or relative morality, relative truth. What's good for you is good for you, and what's good for me is good for me. But the problem with that is all of a sudden we have billions of little godlets running around, deciding what's good and what's not good for themselves. Or, throughout history, you've had other examples where they've said, okay, well, the way we're going to ground this moral law is through the state, through society. Might is right. As that great thinker Spock said, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Is that really how it happens? Well, no, that's how we get totalitarianism. Societies that operate that way are not good societies to live in. Realistically, the only way you can ground a moral law is by coming up with something that not only exists outside of that moral law, but is objective in and of himself or itself. You have to come up with God. Why? Because God is the grounding for saying something is good or something is bad. Otherwise, you can say, I don't like Brussels sprouts. I don't like murder. But saying it is objectively bad, this is something that we should tell other people about, doesn't make sense in a world that can't ground it. Removing God from the equation doesn't eliminate your problem, it makes it more complicated. Morality shows that God exists. If there is no God, there is no morality. It's what philosophers call planting your feet firmly in midair. It doesn't work. But there is morality, so there has to be a God. So the first point is that evil is something. Evil exists. We see it in the world. We see instances of violence, of injustice. These things rightly move us, as they should. And this creates some real problem for relativists. But that doesn't necessarily solve the problem of evil, does it? Which brings me to my next point. Evil is not some thing. My first point was evil is something, but my second point is evil is not some thing. Now, what do I mean? Well, what do I mean by that is that evil is not some sort of stuff. I'm not walking down the street and I trip over some evil and all of a sudden I'm depraved. It doesn't work like that. This is not how evil is. It doesn't have what intellectuals like to call ontological status. It's a good word, eh? It doesn't have existence. You can't hold evil in your hand. Evil exists, we know it exists, but at the same time, we have to be careful when we talk about evil not to give it too much credence. Because evil is not some thing. We need to make sure that we're not confusing things when we say that evil exists. Evil is real, but it's not real in the same way that you and I are real. It's kind of like your shadow. Your shadow exists, but your shadow is not something that holds ontological status. It isn't something as much as the absence of something. It's the absence of the light. Evil is a real state of affairs, but evil isn't a thing, it's the absence of good. And this is how we talk about it. We use words in the English language that express this. Words like lawlessness, the lack of law. Disorder, the lack of order. Irresponsibility, the lack of responsibility. Unrestrained, the lack of restraint. Unruly, uncontrolled. We understand that there are things that exist, but don't exist. You know what I'm saying? And not unsurprisingly, this is one of the very first themes of the Bible. In the very first chapter of the very first book, we see that this world that we live in was made beautifully. And all other controversies about this first chapter aside, there is a common theme that despite some differences that are in-house in the Christian community, we can see that there's a repetitiveness about this chapter. Verse 4, it says, God saw that the light was good. Verse 10, God saw that something else was good, and then something else is good in verse 12, and verse 21 is good, and 18 it's good, and 25 it's good, and 31 it says that God saw everything that he made, and behold, and this is for the thick people in the original audience, he says, it was very good. 7 times good. But all we have to do is turn the page to realize that things don't turn out very well. We get the story of Adam and Eve and testing and their decision to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And let me just stop there for a second and express that that word knowledge that's used in the context, the biblical word yadah, doesn't necessarily mean the difference between good and evil, as it is Adam and Eve calling the shots themselves. Them deciding, outside of how God has defined good and evil, to say, no, I know what good and evil is now. And in one way, nobody can break the law of God. In the same way that nobody can break the law of gravity. I may want to fly, and so I can fashion a cape, climb to the top of this building, and jump off. But am I going to break the law of gravity, or the law of gravity is it going to break me? It's a little bit obvious, isn't it? In the same way, when we try to break the law of God, we break ourselves. And so, yes, Adam and Eve broke God's law. But what happened? There was a brokenness that came with it. Adam and Eve made that decision to call the shots. Now, just to swing back, the person that I was talking to in that bus stop, He expressed that if God is absolutely powerful, he would be able to deal with evil and tragedy. And if he was absolutely good, he would want to deal with evil and tragedy. But, he said, seemingly random evil and tragedy, like he saw, and other instances that we see of gun violence all over the world, of injustice, these things exist. And, as he said, the God that Christians and other theists believe in couldn't possibly exist because of it. But as I said before, he's not actually pining about the law of non-contradiction. He's personally hurt. And this objection doesn't actually hold water with the God that we know. Why? Because God has a character. He has a status as who he is. And there are certain things in this world that are outpourings of his character. One of them, I would argue, being logic. Things exist because God's character is perfect. And so when I've done this presentation in the past, I've been very aware to scout out and find the biggest guy in the room that I can find. And I do so, I'm not going to do it today, don't worry. I do so, and I pull him out of the crowd and I give him a paperclip. And I say, can you take this paperclip and make a square out of it? Can you do that for me? And of course, they're always like, oh yeah, of course I can do this. Tell me more about it. And they make a square. And then I say, that's a nice square. Now, could you please alter that square and make it into a circle for me? And they go, oh, of course I can. A circle. And they make a circle. The circles aren't as good as the squares statistically, but we'll let that go. And then I say, okay, that's great. Can you please turn that next into me as a square circle? Can you make a square circle for me? And I kind of look at you and go, what? A square circle. Can you please turn that into a square? No, don't round the edges. Make it into a square circle. Perfectly square and perfectly circle. They kind of stare at you and go, I can't do that. You go, hold on, are you not strong enough to make that into a square circle for me? Are you not big enough to make that into a square circle? Are you not intelligent enough to make that into a square circle for me? You see, making square circles is not a function of power or strength or desire. Even if you had infinite power, you still would not be able, to do something that is logically contradictory. That doesn't make any sense. And it isn't that God is not powerful enough to solve the problem of evil. It's that the notion of making humanity, who are broken because of the decisions of our first parents, who are marred with sin, suddenly revert to the way it was before and be perfectly good, is logically impossible this side of heaven. God doesn't live up to the parameters of logic. Logic exists because he is perfect. And we have a moral responsibility. It's the one of the things that sets humanity apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. For God to suddenly take away that moral responsibility would not only make God's character morally problematic, it would also be logically impossible. This is a reality that we live in. But in the Christian worldview, there is no contradiction between the power of God, the existence of God, and the existence of evil. It's just a reality. And realistically, although we will give lip service to wanting God to solve all of the evil in the world that we see, and a lot of us would express that that's what we would want, but if God were to show up and solve the problem of evil at midnight, where would you be at 12:01? You see, a lot of the times we're worried about the evil out there, and we forget about the evil in here. If I'm honest with myself, I know there's plenty of evil in there. And as much as, yes, we want God to solve this problem we struggle with, at the same time, we have to be honest with ourselves. Where is God going to stop when he solves the problem of evil? At the action level? At the thinking level? Humanity points the finger at God, asking why he hasn't done more about the problem of evil. And I think realistically, God can point the finger right back at us and say, well, same question. Why haven't you done enough about the problem of evil? C.S. Lewis, who I quoted before, puts it this way. He says, when the author walks out on the stage, the play is over. But we can do better than avoiding a contradiction. Which brings me back to the quote from Bertrand Russell, who said, again, how can you talk about God when you're kneeling at the bed of a dying child? But this begs the question, what does the atheist Bertrand Russell have to say when he's kneeling at the bed of a dying child?
If the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, meaningless tragedies like the crashing of the bus are exactly what we should expect, along with equally meaningless good fortune. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt.
Let me finish that quote for you. In a world of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky. And we won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Richard Dawkins. Is that true? What does the person who denies the existence of God have to say at the bed of the dying child? It's not good news. You're just a product of time plus matter plus chance. You're just a one bag of meat on an endless line of bags of meat, and DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance. Another famous atheist, friend of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, put it this way. To the dumb question, why me, the cosmos barely bothers to return the reply, why not? That was the question I asked as an 11-year-old. Why me? Paralysis and fluke medical conditions, they happen to other people. They don't happen to me. Why do they happen to me? In other words, the answer to the cosmos is nothing. The answer to the child in the bed is nothing. Now, I gave this presentation in March at a conference in Sudbury, Ontario. And in the Q&A, a woman stood up and she said, 3 months ago, my child died. What do you have to say to me? Now, on one level, there is the philosophical problem, right? I can say, well, how are you positing good? And how are you positing evil? Or are you coming up with a moral lawgiver? But that's not what that person needs. And realistically, the Christian worldview can say more than just solve a philosophical problem. Which brings me to my third point. God has and is responding to evil. And I want to preface this by saying that specifically what we see in Scripture is that there is no such thing as truly purposefulness evil. Just because evil may appear to be pointless to you does not mean it must be pointless in general. Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga puts it this way. He says, if you are looking into a pup tent for a St. Bernard and you don't see one, it is reasonable to assume that there is no St. Bernard in the pup tent. But if you are looking into the pup tent for a no-see-um, which is an extremely small insect that's bite is out of proportion to its size, and you don't see any, it is not reasonable to assume that there are no no-see-ums. Because after all, no one can see him. He goes on to say this, many assume that if there were good reasons for the existence of evil, they would be accessible to our minds. More like St. Bernards than like no-see-ums. But why should this be the case? Here's the thing. When I was an 11-year-old, sitting in my bed, crying myself to sleep, because my life had drastically and completely changed, there is no way I could see the plan that God had for me. Now, it's not wrong of me to vent my frustration. And one of the comforts that I see within Scripture is the fact that Psalm 23 says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And yet the chapter that immediately precedes it starts, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The comfort that I found in that was that the God who heard the person who said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and the person who expressed that the Lord is my shepherd, the same God saw those two things as valid forms of worship. Our God is big enough to handle our pain, our suffering. He's big enough to deal with that, and we need to come to him with that. But the reality is that we only have a fraction of the picture at hand. Now, please, don't hear me as downplaying any of the pain and suffering we experience in our lives. I don't want to do that. I know some people who are dealing with extreme pain on a daily basis. And there is no downplaying to that. And there aren't always clear explanations, at least that I can articulate, to why a lot of these things happen. In fact, I dealt with a long time with almost survivor's guilt, because I knew people who had all sorts of medical conditions, and they were not healed. Why me instead of them? I have no idea. But here's what I do know. I know that God is in control, and I know that God works out all things according to the counsel of his will. There is no purposeless evil. And we see this throughout Scripture. Ephesians says, "In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will." In Isaiah, God says, "I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purposes, calling a bird of prey from the east, and a man of my counsel from a far country. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, and I will do it." And one of the clearest examples in Genesis 50, the story of Joseph. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." In other words, God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. Christianity doesn't just leave us with a consolation for this broken world. It gives us a promise of restoration in the brokenness that we find ourselves in. Why? Because God has sent his Son for broken humanity to offer mercy instead of justice, so that they can be forgiven rather than condemned. The God of the Christian worldview is not an indifferent God like that of theism, or an aloof God that we see in deism, but a God who steps into his creation personally to do something about the problem of pain and suffering. God is actively doing something about this. God has stepped out of eternity and put on humanity in the person of the second person of the Trinity in order to do something about this problem. He became like us and walked among us to be with us in order to do something for us, to ultimately rescue us. He was rejected and despised and abandoned and tortured and murdered. God says, "You want to talk about evil? Let me tell you about my Son. What evil has done to him? What I did to him on your behalf because of that problem." The Christian view of God is very different than other worldviews' views of God, in the sense that it believes that God stepped down and suffered. Friends, if you're angry about evil, God is not your enemy. Sin is your enemy. The Christian view of God is very different than any other worldview of God, because God, in the sense that we understood, stepped down into our humanity, into our reality, and suffered. It's interesting, throughout Scripture we see a description of God in this English word that we use, compassionate. God is compassionate. It's one of the main themes of who the God of the Bible is. But this English word that we use, compassionate, is actually a combination word in Latin. Com, meaning with, and passion, meaning suffering. God is not indifferent. He's compassionate. He steps into the suffering. There's a very famous atheist, a philosopher, a Frenchman named Albert Camus. And in his day, Albert Camus was bigger than Richard Dawkins, who I quoted before, far bigger. And Albert Camus was famous for this dialogue on the emptiness and the silence of the universe. So we have all these problems, and what is the universe's answer? Nothing. We're all there is. And yet, not long before his death in a tragic car accident, he wrote these words. He said, God's solution consisted first in experiencing pain. The God-man suffers too with patience. Evil and death can no longer be entirely imputed to God, since he suffers and dies. The night on Golgotha is so important in the history of man only because, in its shadows, the divinity seemingly abandoned its traditional privilege and lived through, to the end, despair included, the agony of death. Now, I don't know if Albert Camus ever put his trust in Jesus. But it did come out that in the months leading up to his death in that tragic car accident, he was meeting with pastors and priests in Paris. I don't know if he ever believed in the truth of what we call the gospel, the good news of what Jesus has done, but I know he wanted it to be true. He saw the reality that evil is something, but evil is not something. And God has and is responding to the problem of evil that we see in this world. Friends, we worship a God who understands our pain and our suffering. And the reason that I prefaced this talk with the title, The Problem of Pain and Suffering, when it's often articulated as the question of pain and suffering, is because a question needs an answer, but a problem needs a solution. We have a solution. We may not fully understand or be able to articulate what we experience when we go through instances of pain and suffering. But we know that God is not distant. He's compassionate, abounding in steadfast love, and desires us to step into a relationship with that. If you're hearing this for the first time, there are people at this church today who would love to be able to speak with you about that hope, that truth, that there's a solution to the pain that we experience, not just an answer.